So we expect more files to be released of the Twitter files, which we've seen now. 4 major revelations and a lot more to come. It is Springfield's Morning News. I'm Greg Bishop on 92.7 WMAY, Springfield's News and Talk. And censorship is something that some people advocate for. As we saw in the past 2.5 years of COVID-19, there was a lot of censorship going on around the COVID pandemic. Everything from people saying that you can't talk about alternative therapies to if you say that masks don't work, then you're going to be taken off of YouTube, for instance, a variety of other different types of censorship that happened. And there was a lot of speculation that this was at the behest of government. And if that was the case, that was a severe violation of the First Amendment and free speech principles and free press principles. But a lot of that was speculation. Well, now it seems that the revelations coming out are indeed pretty clear that there was some government involvement. But I want to get your thoughts on some of this. Again, 217-629-7970. That's the phone number here with Springfield's Morning News on 92.7 WMAY, Springfield's News and Talk. Elon Musk bought Twitter, and you've got the billionaire who paid $44 billion for it and has been releasing all kinds of stuff to various independent journalists. Musk, by the way, most recently wrote on Twitter, the woke mind virus is either defeated or nothing else matters. Again, the woke mind virus, he says, is either defeated or nothing else matters. Luke Rudkowski, who is he's been an online commentator for a long time, he replied and said, we are either in mass awakening or a total collapse of society. Musk replying to that saying, exactly. So the woke mind virus is something that Musk talked about before he bought Twitter, and it was in reference to what he saw a lot of people freaking out about jokes on Twitter. And in particular, you had the Babylon Bee that had their account suspended if they didn't take out a tweet about a Biden administration official who's transgender being the man of the year. And that was after another publication said that this individual is woman of the year. Musk saw it as abhorrent, called it a woke mind virus, and then eventually he bought Twitter. And we get to now some of the most recent revelations from the Twitter files. And people, rightfully so, say that, social media companies are private companies and they can do what they want. Sure thing. Does the same argument hold up for those who say that, a website designer must provide services to individuals based on their sexuality? So interesting to see kind of the double standards there on some of these arguments. But, Twitter being and Facebook being and Instagram being, Google being private companies, they have the right to, do things. But the line is crossed when that is done at the behest of government. And the first few Twitter files that were released didn't really show that. However, the most recent ones do indeed show just that there were federal agencies meeting with Twitter officials that were urging them to take certain actions or putting seeds in to watch out for the Hunter Biden laptop story. That's going to be Russian misinformation, which it wasn't and is not, and really does highlight a pay-to-play scheme that House Republicans are set to investigate when they take over the House. But what you have is the most recent files being released from Michael Schellenberger, who is an independent journalist, and it's about the removal of Donald Trump. And if you go through, you can read all about it in the series of tweets that he puts out there, including the coordination between the Democrat Party officials and Twitter. And you can imagine that other social media companies also were being visited by federal agencies. And if they had any role in telling social media companies to censor certain types of speech, that's a violation of the First Amendment and would be a huge bombshell that should rock the political space. Will it? We'll watch. Get a couple of phone calls here. Good morning. You're on WMAY.
My worry is that it won't, because the majority of people listening are stupid. I mean, what we just had happen in the 2020 election with our federal government working with Twitter, and we know they were working with Facebook,
right.
And we know they were working with other social media, and they're working with mainstream media as well. None of this is secret.
Well, but there's a difference. Let me just really quick say that the Department of National Intelligence, they did have meetings with social media companies, as they have meetings with utility companies, as they have meetings with a whole vast private businesses, talking about cybersecurity, talking about making sure that you have all the proper tech that keeps you safe from hackers and whatnot. Those meetings took place, and the former DNI director said just that. However, it's other meetings that may have taken place with members of the FBI going and putting pressure on social media companies to censor speech. If that happened, that's a huge violation of free speech.
On things like Hunter Biden, on things like whether or not lockdowns were good for kids, they were taking actual Stanford scientists and literally saying, their science is misinformation, therefore ban it. Take it off Twitter, delete their DMs. Anybody that sends this story, grandmas, whatever, let's ban them.
Yep.
I mean, they took it too far. And the people listening, you aren't going to get up in arms because you're a bunch of freaking sheeple at this point. I mean,
well, not everybody. I think talk radio listeners.
Everybody. I've gone far enough that if people aren't up in arms now, and we haven't even gotten to the part of the January 6th part of the Twitter leak file stuff, we're just to the Trump stuff.
And we haven't really seen the full scope of the COVID situation and the censorship around there, and that's what we expect to see coming down the line. Appreciate the call, 217-629-7970. That's the phone number if you want to sound off on this. Again, 217-629-7970. Donald Trump was one of the targets, of course, of the Twitter policies, and we'll hear from him from back in 2020, where he seemed to call this out when he was still president. So we'll get to that in a moment. Also, we'll hear from that Stanford professor who was censored, and even flash back to Dr. Anthony Fauci, who Musk recently said on Twitter that Musk's pronouns, are now prosecute Fauci. So we'll hear more about some of that as well. Good morning. You're on WMAY.
I think two quick points. I just want to, if we're going to talk about government getting involved in censoring, I think at least it'd be fair to point out that if this was going on, if government was reaching out to Twitter and censoring, this was the Trump administration. Everyone's up in arms about, these were the leftists doing this, but if these were people from the government,
you're right.
Trump people.
You're absolutely right. The same deep staters who likely leaked a whole bunch of documents and phone calls that Trump had with foreign leaders, the same deep state actors who were, colluding with the Democratic Party to bring about the Russia-Trump collusion narrative, to get FISA warrants to spy on the former Trump campaign and the first few months of his administration. You're right. Yeah, it was Trump administration officials in the deep state who were indeed conducting this shadowy operation that undermined the Trump administration.
I also think those first files that came out, they're sitting Trump MAGA Republicans that were reaching out to Twitter too to get things pulled. It wasn't just the left and the deep state.
But the vast majority of those were Democrats and the operatives within the Biden campaign that were doing that. Stay tuned. We got much more to come, including more of your phone calls here with Springfield's Morning News on 92.7 WMAY, Springfield's News.
News with Greg Bishop on 92.7 WMAY.
All right, we've been talking about the Twitter files, and you can also chime in at 217-629-7970. And we've got the fourth round of Twitter files that were released over the weekend. Round 3 was released on Friday. But the first round that was released highlighted some of the initial findings that we're likely to hear a lot more about. And in particular, it highlighted how one member of Congress did reach out to officials at Twitter, and that was California U.S. Representative Ro Khanna, who mentioned to Twitter officials that it looks like there might be some violations of the spirit of the First Amendment. Ro Khanna recently on Fox News talking about this, saying that he didn't do anything that was extraordinary. He just merely pointed out his concerns about the free press being suppressed. And here he is talking about this on Fox News. And go.
Thank you, Maria, but I don't think what I did was anything exceptional. I was just standing up for our Constitution and for our First Amendment. It is wrong to censor newspapers. It is wrong to censor journalists. Look, the New York Post hasn't written a kind thing about me in my 6 years in Congress. They're a conservative point of view paper. But that doesn't mean that you can stop publishing their pieces or articles or censor their journalists from sharing stories. So it just offended the basic principles that our country is based on.
So again, Ro Khanna making it clear that he made this decision to reach out to Twitter when it was speculated that they were censoring speech, saying this seems to violate the spirit of the First Amendment. And that first release of Twitter files didn't indicate federal involvement. However, the most recent Twitter files do indicate federal involvement, with Twitter officials meeting with members of the FBI, for instance. And we know that Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook said the FBI would meet with them and say, hey, watch out, there's some Russian disinformation that's coming. But it turns out that wasn't necessarily the case. But the most recent Twitter files do indicate some of the actions taken to suppress Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, even back in 2020, he talked about being suppressed and even mentioned Yoel Roth, who's the former head of Twitter's safety division that made a lot of these proclamations about Donald Trump. And here's Donald Trump back when he was president talking about this inside the Oval Office. And go.
Here's one. This is the arbiter. This guy is the arbiter of what's supposed to go on Twitter. He's the one he thought, and he used CNN as a guide. CNN, which is fake news. He uses CNN as a guide. His name is Yoel Roth, and he's the one that said that mail-in balloting, you look mail-in. No fraud? No fraud? Really? Why don't you take a look all over the country? There's cases all over the country. If we went to mail-in balloting, our election all over the world would look as a total joke. It would be a total joke. There's such fraud and abuse. And you know about harvesting, where they harvest the ballots and they go and grab them and they go to people's houses and they say, sign here.
So again, Trump back then even highlighting how they knew that Twitter and Yoel Roth was suppressing speech on Twitter and that social media outlet. Other outlets you can imagine as well. Somebody else who was censored was a Stanford professor. And this deals with something else we're likely to hear a lot more about, and that is the suppression of conversations about COVID-19. And listen, the history of that is, hey, Fauci said don't wear masks, and then he said wear masks. You had Illinois public health officials saying there's no threat to the general public multiple times, and then all of a sudden saying we got to lock everything down and keep your kids home from school and close your business and skyrocket unemployment. And then, the whole idea of where the virus originated. Did it come from the wet markets? If you talked about it coming out of a lab, you were a COVIDiot and you were hurting people and you were being suppressed. Then it comes out months later, the lab leak theory is actually a legitimate theory and likely where it came from. So you can see that all of the suppression of speech around COVID as well, very troubling. Well, Jay Bhattacharya, I'm pretty sure I just butchered his last name, Stanford University, he was part of the Barrington Declaration of various scientists saying that locking schools down and keeping kids from going to school is going to harm children. And he was suppressed, and the Great Barrington Declaration was suppressed, and Twitter doing that suppression. The professor went on Fox News to talk about being suppressed. Here's some of what he had to say in this conversation back and forth with Laura Ingraham about being suppressed on Twitter and the problems that arose around that. Here's Jay Bhattacharya.
From a public policy point of view, if you look at what the government did, I suspect very strongly that there was some government direction of this. I've been involved with this lawsuit that's been brought by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's offices against the Biden administration. And we've uncovered tremendous evidence that there were federal agencies that were directing social media companies about what to censor, even who to censor. Now, if that is actually the case, that this blacklisting was directed by the government against American citizens, that's a direct violation of my civil rights. It's a direct violation of the First Amendment, and every American should be outraged.
So are we going to see anything done from this? Are we going to see investigations of the federal government's involvement in suppressing speech on social media companies like Twitter? We would only know about this and actually have the receipts if Musk purchased Twitter, which he did. So are we going to see the receipts being forced out by Congress when it comes to Facebook, when it comes to Google, when it comes to other social media companies? All of this, of course, snowballing and pretty frightening stuff in this country where we champion free speech and free press. But now we're starting to see that social media, as many of us have suspected, were indeed being told by the federal government about what to suppress. It wasn't just Donald Trump and all of his bombastic talk. It wasn't just somebody talking about ballot harvesting and trying to suppress that. It was also suppression around COVID-19 and just general suppression of conservatives on social media channels, in particular, like Dan Bongino, who was recently, blacklisted. And he was out there talking about trying to find alternative avenues and alternative parallel platforms from banking to social media to get around this censorship that everybody knew was happening. But the fact that it's now at the behest of government being shown through Twitter files, that's a huge problem. And again, you got Elon Musk, who's been pretty bombastic on Twitter after having taken it over, and some of his most recent tweets seems to be targeting Dr. Anthony Fauci. And most recently, he said on Twitter that his pronouns are prosecute Fauci. Well, some internet sleuths went back and found Fauci talking about gain-of-function research way back in 2013. Here's what some of that had to say from Dr. Anthony Fauci himself, talking about doing gain-of-function research.
It's triggered a concern, understandably, clearly, that if you give a gain of function of a pathogenic virus to make it more transmissible, that's a whole different story than some of the other things we faced. So let's get down to what of reaction, sometimes bordering on the very extreme, as shown by this editorial from the New York Times, an engineered doomsday. We at NIAID, being the major funders of most but not all of these people, we obviously were connected to that because they wanted to know, since you're our major funders, what kind of research will you fund? There was a major... First of all, questions have come up about the concern of the danger of people that you fund. NIAID, NIH, certainly CDC, only funds and conducts gain-of-function research on H5N1 highly pathogenic avian influenza viruses for researchers who are highly trained, skilled, experienced, and adequately regulated.
So, again, Fauci talking about gain-of-function research way back in 2013, and that was one of the topics as well that seemed to be suppressed. If you talked about gain-of-function research on social media, you didn't have an amount of reach that you probably should have had. And all of this seeming to snowball. I don't think we've heard the last of it by far. There's also major concerns about Twitter previously under different ownership of child porn that was on Twitter. And Twitter doing now under Musk, trying to clean all that out. But there's even those possible things that need to come out in full transparent hearings as to the impacts of social media. What they were censoring, going out there and saying Dan Bongino can't talk about a parallel economy. Dr. Jay Badaracha can't say that, locking kids home from school is bad for their health. Donald Trump questioning mail-in ballots and whether those are possibly, open to fraud. You can't talk about that on Twitter. But apparently Twitter was free reign when it came to child exploitation. And that it's just mind-boggling what they went out there and actively censored versus what they let just have free reign. Very troubling stuff. Obviously not the end of this story.